On the night I won the Academy Award, I was not allowed to sit with my cast. I arrived at the Coconut Grove nightclub at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles on February 29, 1940, wearing a rhinestone-studded turquoise gown with white gardenias in my hair. I had spent time on that dress. I had spent time on those gardenias. I was going to be the first Black person in the history of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences to win an Oscar, and I was going to look like someone who deserved to be in that room. The hotel had a strict no blacks policy. David Selznick, the producer of Gone with the Wind, had to call in a personal favor just to get me through the door. Not to sit at the main table with Vivien Leigh and Clark Gable and Olivia de Havilland, where the rest of my cast was seated near the stage, just to get me into the building. They put me at a small table against the far wall. Me and my escort and my white agent. 3 people at a table for 2, as far from the stage as the room allowed. From that table against the far wall, I walked up and accepted the first Academy Award ever given to a Black performer in the history of cinema. When it was over, my white co-stars went to celebrate at a club across town. I was not permitted to enter. My name is Hattie McDaniel. I was born the youngest of 13 children of parents who had been enslaved. I worked as a maid to survive while I tried to become an actress. I became one of the most celebrated performers of my generation, and Hollywood made sure at every step of that journey that I understood exactly where I stood. My father, Henry McDaniel, had been born into slavery on a plantation in Virginia. He was sold as a child. He escaped before the end of the Civil War and joined the 122nd United States Colored Troops, fighting for the Union. After the war, he became a Baptist preacher and minstrel performer. He met my mother, Susan Holbert, in Nashville, Tennessee, where she was already a well-known gospel singer. Both of them had been enslaved. Both of them had escaped. Both of them built a life from whatever came after. I was born on June 10, 1893, in Wichita, Kansas, the youngest of 13 children. We moved to Colorado when I was 7. I finished high school in Denver. My father preached and sang at church. My mother sang in the choir. The performing was in everything we did. It was the language of the household, the way feeling was expressed, the thing that had survived when much else had not. I was the first Black woman to sing on American radio in the United States. I say this and nobody remembers it. It is a fact. It happened. But the facts that surround Hattie McDaniel have always been arranged around other people's priorities, not mine. When the stock market crashed in 1929, I worked as a washroom attendant at Sam Pick's Club in Milwaukee. The club hired only white performers, but patrons heard me singing and told the owner to make an exception. He did. I performed there for over a year before moving to Los Angeles. In Los Angeles, I looked for film work and found very little of it. To survive, I worked as a maid. A real one, cleaning houses, cooking meals, doing the work that the industry would later pay me to perform on screen. I appeared in over 300 films. I received on-screen credit for 83 of them. That gap, more than 200 performances erased from the record, is the first thing you need to understand about what Hollywood thought I was worth. Gone with the Wind premiered in Atlanta, Georgia on December 15, 1939. Atlanta turned it into a spectacle. 300,000 people lined a 7-mile motorcade route from the airport to the Georgian Terrace Hotel. The governor declared a state holiday. The mayor closed the schools. Every white star of the film was there. Vivien Leigh, Clark Gable, Olivia de Havilland, Leslie Howard, riding through streets lined with people who had come from across the state to see them. I was not there. Georgia's Jim Crow laws would have required me to stay in a segregated hotel, to enter through different doors, to sit in a separate section of the theater. David Selznick had tried to bring me. He contacted MGM and asked for permission. MGM advised him not to. The laws were the laws. Georgia was Georgia. Clark Gable found out and told Selznick he was going to boycott the premiere. He was not going to ride through the streets of Atlanta while Hattie McDaniel was not permitted to sit in the same theater as the audience watching her work. It was one of the finest things anyone in Hollywood did for me. I told him to go. I did not want Clark Gable standing in a hotel room in Los Angeles while Atlanta waited for him. I told him to go and represent the picture. He went. Selznick made sure my photograph appeared prominently in the program. The movie opened to an ovation that lasted minutes. Selznick also altered the advertising posters for the film in the southern states, removing the faces of all the black actors. Gone with the Wind, starring Vivien Leigh and Clark Gable, with no indication that anyone who looked like me had been part of making it. The same producer who tried to bring me to Atlanta had decided that in certain markets, my face was a liability. Both of those things were true of David Selznick simultaneously. The man who fought to include me in the premiere program, and the man who erased my face from the Southern posters. That is not a contradiction. That is Hollywood in 1939. A place where a white man could be genuinely sympathetic and still make the calculation that my face was too much for some markets to accept. That is the accounting I lived inside for my entire career. I auditioned for the role of Mammy in costume, not in a performance costume, in an actual maid's uniform. The uniform I had worn when I worked as a real maid in the houses of Los Angeles while trying to become an actress. I put it on and I walked into the audition and I gave them Mammy, and I got the part. 1,400 actresses were interviewed for the role of Scarlett O'Hara. Eleanor Roosevelt, the First Lady of the United States, wrote personally to David Selznick asking if her own maid could be given the role of Mammy. I was not confident about getting the part, but I won it in a uniform that was not a costume. The role I played was a woman who had been enslaved, a woman who ran a white family's household with absolute authority, who scolded her owner's daughter and scoffed at Rhett Butler, and possessed more dignity than most of the white characters surrounding her, while still being technically their property. Every picture and every line, it belonged to Hattie. That was what one critic wrote. The NAACP did not agree. NAACP President Walter White singled me out personally. He called me an enemy of my people. A reporter for the New York Post called me that 20th Century Fox specialist in the bug eye. I was accused of being an Uncle Tom, a person who advanced herself at the expense of her race. I answered in The Hollywood Reporter in 1947. I have never apologized for the roles I play. I believe my critics think the public more naive than it actually is. I'd rather play a maid and make $700 a week than be one for $7. I meant that as a statement about economics and survival. The roles offered to Black women in Hollywood in the 1930s were maids or nothing. I could refuse on principle and be invisible, or I could take the roles and be seen. Being seen was the only way to become someone they could not pretend had never existed. I chose to be seen. I played every maid with everything I had, and the Academy watched me do it and gave me an award for it. That was not Uncle Tom. That was strategy. The Academy Award ceremony was held at the Coconut Grove nightclub in the Ambassador Hotel on February 29, 1940. The Ambassador Hotel had a strict no blacks policy. This was Los Angeles, California, and the hotel where Hollywood held its most important annual celebration did not permit black guests. Selznick had to personally call the management and request a special exception for me to be allowed inside the building where I might win the most prestigious award in my industry. They said yes, as a favor. I arrived in my turquoise gown with white gardenias in my hair. I was escorted not to the Gone with the Wind table, where Selznick sat with Vivien Leigh and Clark Gable and Olivia de Havilland near the stage, at the center of the room, but to a small table set against the far wall. Me and my escort, F.P. Yober, and my white agent, William Micklejohn. 3 people at a table for 2, as far from the main action as the room could manage while still technically being in the same building. I sat there through the dinner. I sat there through the early awards. The cameras moved through the room, capturing the faces of Hollywood's finest. The cameras did not find mine. The original film of the ceremony shows the audience during the announcements. Prominent white actors, directors, producers, all captured in their seats. I am nowhere in the footage. When Fay Bainter announced my name, I stood up and walked to the stage. Luella Parsons wrote about it the next morning. If you had seen her face when she walked up to the platform and took the gold trophy, you would have had the choke in your voice that all of us had when Hattie, hair trimmed with gardenias, face alight and dressed up to the Queen's taste, accepted the honor in one of the finest speeches ever given on the Academy floor. I received a plaque-style Oscar, approximately 5.5 inches by 6 inches, smaller than the statuette given to lead actors. I held it. I walked back to my table against the far wall. I sat down. I had just made history in a room that had required a personal favor to let me through the door. That is the specific mathematics of what that night was. Here is what I said at that podium. Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, fellow members of the motion picture industry, and honored guests. This is one of the happiest moments of my life, and I want to thank each one of you who had a part in selecting me for one of their awards for your kindness. It has made me feel very, very humble, and I shall always hold it as a beacon for anything that I may be able to do in the future. I sincerely hope I shall always be a credit to my race and to the motion picture industry. My heart is too full to tell you just how I feel, and may I say thank you and God bless you. One of the finest speeches ever given on that stage. That was what Luella Parsons wrote. She meant it. I was the only winner from Gone with the Wind who was not interviewed after the ceremony. The film won 10 Academy Awards that night, a record that stood for years. Its stars were surrounded by reporters, photographed with their statues. I was not interviewed. The most historic win of the evening had no press coverage of the winner afterward. After the ceremony, the cast went to celebrate at a club that did not permit Black patrons. I did not attend. Whether I was not invited or whether the question was never raised because everyone understood the answer. That detail has blurred over the decades. What has not blurred is this. After the night I made history, my white co-stars went somewhere I was not permitted to go. I went home. My own people were especially happy, I said afterward. They felt that in honoring me, Hollywood had honored the entire race. That was the way I wanted it. And I also went home while Vivian Leigh and Clark Gable went somewhere I could not follow. Both of those things happened on the same night. That is the sentence that describes February 29th, 1940, completely. In 1942, I bought a house in the Sugar Hill neighborhood of Los Angeles. Sugar Hill was an affluent area in West Adams. Large homes, manicured gardens, the kind of neighborhood where success announced itself in the architecture. Several prominent Black entertainers and professionals had moved there. I was one of them. My white neighbors filed a lawsuit to remove me. The lawsuit was based on a restrictive covenant, a legal agreement written into property deeds specifying that homes could only be sold to or occupied by white people. These covenants were common across American cities. They were how segregation was maintained in places without explicit Jim Crow laws. You could not legally prevent a Black person from buying a house. You could make it a contractual violation for a white person to sell one to them. I did not leave quietly. I organized. I contacted other Black residents of Sugar Hill facing the same legal threat. I gathered 250 people who accompanied me to the Superior Court of Los Angeles. I hired attorneys. I made the case that restrictive covenants were unconstitutional. The Superior Court agreed. My case became a precedent. It contributed to the legal architecture that led, 3 years later, to the United States Supreme Court ruling in Shelley v. Kramer that racially restrictive housing covenants were unenforceable. The woman, who had been allowed into the Ambassador Hotel as a special favor, had won a case that changed constitutional law. During World War II, I chaired the Negro Division of the Hollywood Victory Committee, organizing entertainment for Black soldiers. Betty Davis performed for Black regiments as the only white member of an acting troupe I organized that also included Lena Horne and Ethel Waters. That is the Hattie McDaniel the obituaries did not lead with. The organizer, the legal fighter, the woman who gathered 250 people for a court date and won. I left my Oscar to Howard University. Howard was, and is, one of the most important historically Black universities in America. I wanted the award to inspire Black students working toward careers in the arts, who needed to see that the door had been opened. I had held the plaque at a table against the far wall of a hotel that had let me in as a favor, and I wanted it to mean something lasting. Howard University received the Oscar. It was displayed. It became part of what the university offered its students as evidence of what was possible. After the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in April 1968, riots broke out across the country. In the disorder that followed, the Oscar disappeared from Howard University. It has never been found. The Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences has never replaced it. The first Oscar ever won by a Black performer, the plaque I carried back to my table against the far wall on February 29, 1940, is gone. The Academy knows this. They have been asked. They have not acted. When Monique won Best Supporting Actress in 2010 for Precious, she wore a blue gown and white gardenias in her hair, dressed deliberately as I had dressed on the night of my win. In her acceptance speech, she thanked me for enduring all that she had to so that I would not have to. She was the only winner in 70 years to publicly acknowledge what I had endured. 70 years. One acknowledgement. The Oscar is gone. The ceremony where I accepted it is preserved in a film that does not show me walking to the stage. The award itself vanished in the fires that followed the murder of a man who spent his life trying to finish what my generation had started. That is where the Oscar is. Somewhere in that history. The NAACP's campaign against my roles intensified in the late 1940s. Walter White pressed studios to stop making films that degraded Black Americans and singled me out by name. The pressure worked in its own way. Studios became more cautious about the servant roles that had constituted most of my career, and as they became cautious, my film opportunities declined. I moved to radio. In 1947, I became the first African American to star in a weekly radio program aimed at a general audience, The Beulah Show, in which I played a maid. The same role the NAACP had criticized me for playing on screen. But the show was mine. I was the lead. And for the first time in my career, the character I played had a name that was not Mammy. In 1951, while filming the television version of Beulah, I had a heart attack. I recovered enough to record radio programs in 1952. In October of that year, I died of breast cancer. I was 59 years old. I left instructions about where I wanted to be buried. I wanted to be interred at Hollywood Cemetery, now called Hollywood Forever, the resting place of Rudolph Valentino, Cecil B. DeMille, Douglas Fairbanks. The people who had built the industry I had spent my career working in. Hollywood Cemetery denied my request. The cemetery was restricted to white burials. I was buried at Rosedale Cemetery, a non-segregated cemetery in Los Angeles. In 1999, Tyler Perry and others raised funds to erect a monument to me at Hollywood Forever Cemetery. The monument is there now. My body is at Rosedale. The industry placed a marker where I was not allowed to be buried and called it a tribute. I have 2 stars on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, a postage stamp issued in 2006, a monument at a cemetery that would not take my body. That is the specific shape of Hollywood's memorial to the first Black person it ever gave an Oscar to. No Black woman won an Academy Award after me for 50 years. 50 years. I won in 1940. Whoopi Goldberg won in 1991 for Ghost. Between those 2 dates, 5 decades of Academy Award ceremonies, hundreds of performances, thousands of nominations, not one Black woman stood on that stage. Hold that number. Not as a statistic, as a specific measurement of what the industry decided year after year about who was worth celebrating, about whose face belonged in the spotlight and whose belonged at the table against the far wall. The criticism came from all directions. White audiences sometimes found my characters uncomfortable. The NAACP said I was perpetuating stereotypes. My response, published in The Hollywood Reporter in 1947, I have never apologized for the roles I play. I believe my critics think the public more naive than it actually is. Arthur Treacher is indelibly stamped as a Hollywood butler, but I am sure no one would go to his home and expect him to meet them at the door with a napkin across his arm. I made the calculation that being seen was better than being invisible. Inside the limited roles I was given, I found every inch of dignity and humanity the material could hold, and I put it on screen. The Academy watched me do it and gave me an award for it at a hotel that required a personal favor to let me through the door. She saw herself as a racewoman, my biographer Jill Watts wrote, someone advancing the race. That is what I was. Not just the mammy, not just the maid. Someone who advanced the race through every decision she made. The Sugar Hill lawsuit, the Hollywood Victory Committee, the Oscar she left to Howard University, the Beulah show that made her the first Black lead in a nationally broadcast radio program. My Oscar is gone. My monument is at a cemetery where I am not buried. Betty Davis performed for Black soldiers in a troupe I organized. Clark Gable threatened to boycott Atlanta for me. Monique wore white gardenias in my honor 70 years after I wore them. These are the things that outlasted the table against the far wall. I sincerely hope I shall always be a credit to my race and to the motion picture industry. I will let the record decide whether the motion picture industry was ever a credit to me. The night I won the Academy Award, David Selznick had to call in a personal favor to get me through the door of the hotel where the ceremony was held. A personal favor. For the woman whose performance his own critics were calling the best in the film. For the woman who would walk to that stage and deliver one of the finest acceptance speeches in the history of the ceremony. A personal favor, so that she could be present at the event where she would make history. I made history at a table against the far wall, in a turquoise gown with white gardenias in my hair, seated as far from the center of the room as possible while still being technically inside it. I made history, and then I went home while my co-stars went somewhere I was not permitted to go. My father had been born into slavery. He escaped. He fought for the Union. He became a preacher. He moved his family west looking for something better. His youngest daughter became the first Black person to win an Academy Award and attended the ceremony as a special favor at a hotel with a no Blacks policy. That is one generation. One generation from slavery to the Oscar stage. The distance is enormous. The table against the far wall tells you how much was still to cross. 50 years before the next Black woman stood where I stood, my Oscar is gone. The cemetery would not take my body. The cameras did not film my walk to the stage. I sincerely hope I shall always be a credit to my race and to the motion picture industry. The motion picture industry can decide for itself whether it was a credit to me.